My name is Elena Mercer. I'm 29 years old, and for 34 months, my parents called every single place I applied for work and told them I had a criminal record. They said I'd committed financial fraud. They said I'd stolen money. They said I was unstable, dishonest, dangerous to trust around cash. None of it was true. I have never been arrested. I have never stood in front of a judge. The only ticket I've ever gotten in my life was for parking too long outside a public library when I was 21. But by the time I turned 29, truth didn't matter anymore. Not to hiring managers, not to small-town employers, not to the people who heard criminal record and decided that was all they needed to know. If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from? And what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. By then, I was living at Riverside Women's Shelter outside Toledo, sleeping in a narrow bed with a metal frame that squeaked every time I turned over. I washed my hair in a gas station sink 3 blocks away because the shelter showers went cold after 6 in the morning, and if you missed your turn, you missed it. I learned how to make 1 cup of soup last an entire day. I learned which churches gave out bread on Thursdays, which pharmacy bathrooms stayed unlocked the longest, and how to smile when people looked at you with that careful kind of pity that feels worse than disgust. There is something about being poor in public that strips the skin off your dignity 1 layer at a time. And there is something even worse about knowing you are not there because you failed, but because the 2 people who were supposed to love you most made it their mission to make sure you never got back up. My father texted me once a week. Always the same tone. Never loud, never vulgar, never obviously cruel enough that you could show it to a stranger and make them understand. That was his gift. He knew how to sound reasonable while destroying you. Most weeks it was some version of the same message. Come home. Apologize. Maybe we can work something out. Sometimes it got dressed up in softer clothes. Your mother isn't sleeping. We're worried. This doesn't have to continue. But every text carried the same message underneath it. Surrender. And maybe we will stop hurting you. I stopped replying after the first month. I still saved every message. The worst part was not even the hunger, or the shelter, or the job interviews that died before they had a chance to begin. The worst part was how easy they made it look. A phone call here, a warning there, a concerned parent, a grieving mother, a father just trying to protect his daughter from her own bad choices. They never had to raise a hand. They never had to chase me down the street. They just leaned on the right lies in the right places, and the world did the rest. That Tuesday morning started like most mornings at the shelter. I woke before dawn because the woman in bed 9 had a cough that rattled the windows. I folded my blanket, tied my hair back, and stood in line for instant coffee that tasted like burned cardboard. Outside, the sky was the color of old dishwater, and the parking lot was still wet from rain the night before. Monica, the shelter director, was at the front desk flipping through intake forms with her reading glasses low on her nose. Nobody was talking much. Most mornings we all moved around one another like ghosts, conserving energy for a day that would probably take more than we had. I was carrying a plastic cup of coffee back toward the common room when the front door opened. A woman stepped inside like she had been there before, though I knew I would have remembered her if she had. She looked to be in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, with silver blonde hair pinned neatly at the back of her neck and a cream-colored coat that looked too expensive for a place like that. She wasn't flashy. That made her stand out more. Everything about her was quiet, controlled, deliberate. In one hand, she carried a worn leather briefcase, not a purse, not a tote bag, a real briefcase, dark brown, old at the corners, the kind that looked like it had held serious things for a very long time. Monica looked up first. "Can I help you?" The woman's eyes moved across the room once, then settled on me. For one strange second, I had the wild thought that my father had hired someone, that this was a social worker, or a county investigator, or another person sent to drag my name through one more system I couldn't fight. My hand tightened around the coffee cup so hard the lid bent inward. Then she crossed the room, stopped in front of me, and spoke in a calm, even voice. "Are you Elena Mercer?" I swallowed. "Yes." She gave one small nod, then lifted the briefcase slightly, as if presenting proof of something I didn't yet understand. Your grandmother paid me to find you." And just like that, the floor of my life shifted beneath me. The first thing I felt was not hope. It was confusion so sharp it almost made me angry. Hope was something I had stopped trusting a long time ago, somewhere between the third canceled interview and the first night I slept sitting up in a locked gas station bathroom. So when that woman stood in front of me in the shelter lobby holding an old leather briefcase and told me my grandmother had paid her to find me, I did not feel rescued. I felt cornered by a sentence I could not make sense of. My grandmother had been dead for years. Dead people did not send strangers into shelters on gray Tuesday mornings. I must have looked half ready to run because the woman's face softened. "My name is Diane Kessler," she said. "I'm a licensed private investigator." She reached into her coat pocket, took out a business card and her ID, and held them where I could see them without forcing them into my hand. "I know this is a shock. I'm not here to hurt you." That small detail, the ID, the card, the fact that she waited instead of pushing, made me believe her more than anything else could have. Monica, the shelter director, looked from Diane to me, then quietly opened the office door beside the front desk. I nodded before I even realized I was doing it. A minute later, I was sitting in a metal folding chair across from Monica's battered desk, while rain tapped softly against the narrow window. Diane sat across from me with the briefcase resting on the desk between us. She didn't open it yet. She just folded her hands over the handle and let me catch up. "My grandmother is dead," I said finally, because it was the only sentence my brain seemed able to form. "Yes," Diane said. "I know. She hired me before she passed." I stared at her. "Why?" Diane held my gaze for a moment, like she was deciding how direct to be. Then she said, "Because she was afraid of what your father would do once she was gone." That hit me harder than I expected. Not because it sounded impossible, but because some part of me had always known it might be true. My father, Howard Mercer, was the kind of man everyone in Benton Falls trusted on sight. He had spent years as a plant supervisor, wore pressed shirts even on Saturdays, remembered people's names, shook hands like he meant it, and served as a deacon at church. In public, he was measured, helpful, solid. At home, he was still measured. That was the problem. He never had to shout to control a room. He just made obedience sound reasonable and resistance sound childish. In our house, everything had an explanation that made his control look like love. I did not get my own house key because a young woman shouldn't come and go at all hours. My paychecks went into a joint account because you're not experienced enough to manage money yet. When I brought home information about a bookkeeping certificate at the community college, he barely glanced at it before saying, "You don't need strangers filling your head with nonsense when your family needs you here." My mother, Sharon, almost never disagreed with him directly. She turned his rules into softer language, dressed them in concern, and set them in front of me like that made them easier to swallow. By the time I was 26, I had been trained to mistake confinement for safety so many times that I barely knew the difference. My grandmother, Evelyn, had known the difference. Looking back, I could see that now. She had never openly challenged my father at family dinners, but there had always been something guarded in the way she watched him, something old and tired and deeply familiar. Once, when he laughed at me for asking about classes at the community college, she said, very quietly, "A woman should always know how to support herself." Another time, after he told me I was safer under his roof than anywhere else, she muttered, "That depends on the roof." At the time, I thought she was just being difficult in that dry, sharp way old women sometimes are when they have stopped trying to please people. Sitting in Monica's office, I understood something I had missed then. She wasn't being difficult. She was warning me in the only ways she still could. "She knew," I said, more to myself than to Diane. Diane gave a small nod. "I believe she understood your father very well." The room went quiet after that. Not empty quiet, heavy quiet, the kind that settles in when a truth you have been avoiding finally sits down in front of you and refuses to leave. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear the low hum of a vacuum cleaner. A car passed outside on the wet street. My whole life, people had told me my father was strict because he cared, and my mother worried because she loved me. Family first. Family protects you. Family knows best. But families like mine know how to hide their cages behind good manners and casserole dishes and church smiles. They know how to make a daughter feel guilty for wanting a key to her own life. I looked at the briefcase again. The leather was worn pale at the corners, like it had been carried for years. Whatever was inside had weight to it. I could feel that even from where I sat. "What's in there?" I asked. Diane rested her hand on the brass clasp and answered in a voice so calm it almost frightened me. "Your way out." I looked at the briefcase, then at Diane, and for a moment I honestly did not know what to do with those words. They sounded too large for Monica's cramped office, too certain for a life like mine. A way out implied there had been a door all along. Until then, my life had mostly felt like a hallway that kept narrowing the older I got. Before Diane opened that case, before she showed me a single document, my mind went back to the first time I had tried to make something for myself without my parents knowing. It was the week after my 26th birthday. Nothing dramatic happened that day. No slammed doors, no screaming, no speech about freedom. That was the thing about houses like ours. The control never needed to be loud. It lived in routine, in habits, in the quiet assumption that every hour of your life already belonged to somebody else. I was standing at the kitchen sink washing a cast-iron skillet while bacon grease cooled in the pan rack and the local news played too loudly from the living room. My mother was clipping coupons at the dining table. My father was in his recliner commenting at the television like the whole country had personally disappointed him. Outside the window, the backyard was gray and brittle with late October cold. And all at once, a thought hit me so hard I had to stop scrubbing. If I stayed, this was it. Not for a season. Not until things got better. Not until my father calmed down or my mother softened or life somehow opened on its own. This was my future. The same sink, the same skillet, the same voice from the other room, the same small permissions dressed up as family values. I stared at my reflection in the dark glass over the sink and felt something close to panic rise in my throat. I was 26 years old, and I did not have a key to my own life. The next morning, I told my mother I was going to the library to return a church devotional booklet. She barely looked up when I said it. "Don't be long," she told me. That was how freedom sounded in our house. Not yes, not no. Just a leash measured in minutes. Benton Falls Public Library sat just off Main Street in an old brick building with chipped white trim and floors that creaked under your feet. I remember everything about that morning because I was terrified. The bell over the front door rang too loudly when I walked in. An elderly man was reading a newspaper near the window. A teenage clerk with earbuds in one ear was stamping due dates behind the circulation desk. Nothing about the place was unusual, but I felt like I was sneaking across a border. I signed up for one of the public computers in the back row and sat down with both hands flat on the desk until they stopped shaking. Then I created a new email address. That was all, just an email. No family last name. No shared recovery number, no password my mother might guess because it was based on a Bible verse or a birthday. I typed my first initial, my middle name, and a few random numbers, then stared at the screen after it was confirmed, almost waiting for something to happen. For an alarm to go off, for someone to tell me I wasn't allowed to have anything of my own. Nothing happened. The library stayed quiet. The printer hummed near the front desk. A page turned somewhere behind me. It was such a small thing, and it felt enormous. Then I opened a job site. I only searched within driving distance at first. I was not trying to run to another state. I was just trying to imagine a day that belonged to me. One listing caught my eye almost immediately. A building supply company in Marlow County was hiring a front desk receptionist. Full-time, Monday through Friday. Benefits after 90 days. Answer phones, schedule deliveries, greet customers, maintain records. I read the post 3 times, and for the first time in years, I let myself think something dangerous. I could do that. Because the truth was, I had always been capable. My father just never let me call it that. I had balanced church fundraiser envelopes, tracked grocery budgets in my head, handled appointment calendars, typed mailing labels, organized pantry inventory, and managed 100 little details that kept other people's lives running smoothly. In our house, those things were called helping. Outside that house, they were called skills. So I filled out the application. I typed carefully, erased whole lines when my nerves got the better of me, then filled them in again. Work history, availability, references. I read every answer twice. When I finally hit submit, I did it fast, before fear could make me open another tab and talk myself out of it. Then I just sat there, staring at the confirmation screen, with my heart pounding in my throat. Hope is a fragile thing when you haven't felt it in a long time. It almost embarrassed me, but it was there. When I got home that evening, the house looked exactly the same, and that was what unsettled me most. My mother was peeling potatoes at the counter. My father sat at the table with the newspaper folded beside his plate. He looked up when I stepped through the door, and there was something in his face I could not name at the time. Not anger, not suspicion exactly, just alertness. Like he had heard something moving behind the walls. "How is the library?" he asked. I set my purse on the chair by the door and tried to keep my voice steady. "Fine." He held my eyes for one beat longer than usual, then nodded. "Good." That was all he said. But during dinner, I could feel it in the room, thin and cold as a draft under a locked door. Something had changed. I had made one private move, one tiny thing that belonged only to me, and somehow my parents already seemed to know the air was shifting. 2 days later, I would learn just how dangerous that tiny act of independence really was. I drove to Marlow County for the interview, with both hands locked on the steering wheel, and my stomach twisted so tight I thought I might be sick. I had borrowed my mother's car under the excuse of returning a casserole dish to a woman from church, which says almost everything you need to know about my life back then. Even trying to get a job required a cover story. Nothing could belong fully to me, not even a trip across county lines. The building supply company sat at the edge of a gravel lot beside stacks of lumber and pallets of concrete mix. A forklift beeped somewhere behind the warehouse. The office itself was plain, almost forgettable, but when I shut off the engine and looked at the glass door with the company name painted across it, it felt like the first real doorway I had seen in years. Inside, the place smelled like sawdust, toner, and stale coffee. A man in his 50s stood when I walked in. He was broad through the shoulders, with silver at his temples and reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck. "Elena Mercer?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He smiled and held out his hand. "Ray Pike, thanks for coming in." That handshake did something to me I wasn't prepared for. It was so normal, so respectful. He looked me in the eye like I was a person applying for a job, not a daughter on loan from somebody else's house. He led me into a small office with beige walls, a filing cabinet in the corner, and a desk worn smooth at the edges. There was a crooked calendar from a local feed store on the wall, and a framed photo of 2 boys in baseball uniforms behind him. It was the kind of office people spent years in. The kind of place where a person built a routine, got paid on Fridays, bought groceries with her own money, and came home tired for ordinary reasons. The interview started well. Better than well, actually. He asked about phones, scheduling, customer service, filing, basic computer work. I answered carefully at first, then with more confidence as the minutes passed. When I told him about keeping records for church donation drives and organizing pantry inventory and notebooks, he nodded like that mattered. When I explained how I handled family calendars and appointment reminders, he wrote something down. At one point, he even smiled and said, "You've got better instincts than a lot of people who come through here." That one sentence warmed me straight through, not because it was praise from a stranger, but because it sounded like proof that my father had been wrong. Maybe all those years of being useful had added up to something after all. Maybe competence did not stop counting just because nobody had paid me for it yet. Then the room changed. Ray glanced down at the papers on his desk, then back at me, and the whole rhythm of the interview shifted. He put on his glasses and cleared his throat. "I usually wouldn't bring something like this up in the room," he said, "but a call came in yesterday, and I need to ask." I felt my spine go stiff. "Ask what?" He chose his next words carefully. "Someone raised concerns about your background." For a second, I honestly did not understand. "My background?" He gave a small nod. They implied there had been some kind of financial issue before, something involving money. It took a moment for the meaning to land. Financial issue. Something involving money. The words were vague, polite, almost bloodless, but they hit hard anyway. "No," I said immediately. "There's nothing like that. None." Ray's expression tightened in that uncomfortable way people get when they want to be fair, but also want to protect themselves. "I'm not accusing you of anything," he said. "I'm just telling you what came in." "That isn't true." My voice sounded thin to my own ears. "I've never stolen from anyone. I've never had any legal trouble." "I understand." But he did not. Not really. He couldn't. He was looking at me across a desk in a supply office in Marlow County, and whatever kindness he had, it still had to live alongside caution. If someone called with a warning specific enough to scare him, he had no reason to gamble on a stranger. I could see that calculation happening in real time. Not cruelty, not malice, just risk. "I'm sorry," he said after a long pause. "I don't think it makes sense for us to move forward." I nodded like I understood, because I didn't trust myself to do anything else. I stood, thanked him for his time, and somehow made it back through the front office without falling apart. Outside, the air had turned colder. I got into the car, shut the door, and just sat there with my hands in my lap, staring at a stack of bagged mulch near the loading area. Someone had called. Someone who knew enough to make the accusation sound believable. Someone who knew I had applied there in the first place. I told myself on the drive home that it could still be something else. A misunderstanding, a rumor, some vicious person in town with too much information and too little decency. I kept reaching for other explanations because the obvious one was too ugly to hold. By the time I turned onto our street, the sky had gone that flat, silvery color Ohio gets before dark in late fall. My father was sitting on the porch with the newspaper open across his lap, one ankle resting over the opposite knee like he had been there all afternoon. He didn't look surprised to see me. He didn't even look up right away. He just turned a page, slow and easy, and asked, "How'd it go?" I stopped at the bottom of the steps with my purse still on my shoulder. "Fine," I said. He gave the smallest nod, eyes still on the paper. "Good." Then he turned another page. That was the moment something cold and unmistakable moved through me for the first time. Not proof, not yet, but suspicion, sharp enough to leave a mark. That suspicion should have been enough. Looking back, I wish I had trusted it sooner. But when the people who raised you spend years teaching you that your instincts are dramatic, selfish, or disrespectful, you do not suddenly become someone who trusts herself just because one bad interview goes wrong. So, after Marlow County, I did what I had been trained to do. I blamed myself first. I told myself maybe I had sounded nervous. Maybe Ray Pike had only wanted someone with more experience. Maybe the call he mentioned had been some rumor, some misunderstanding, some ugly little mistake that had nothing to do with my family. So I applied again, and then again. Over the next 5 weeks, I sent out 4 more applications from the public computers at the Benton Falls Library. A pharmacy in Ridge Hollow needed a cashier. A warehouse outside Linton was hiring for office support. A home goods store in Ashbury wanted weekend help at the service desk. A diner off Route 7 needed a morning hostess. Every time, I used my new email. Every time, I logged out carefully, cleared the browser, and walked home trying not to let hope get too big. And every time, the same thing happened. A reply, a little interest, sometimes even an interview. Then, within a day or two, some version of no. At first, the excuses were thin and polite. "We've decided to move in another direction. The position has been filled. We're looking for someone with a different background." One manager sounded warm on the phone and then never called again. Another canceled less than 24 hours before the interview. After the third one, I started checking my email the way people check weather alerts, bracing for bad news before I even opened the message. I lay awake at night replaying every answer I had given, every line on every application, trying to find the flaw that would explain it. That is what sabotage does when you do not know it is sabotage. It turns your mind against you first. By the time the diner called, I was carrying hope and dread in equal measure. The place sat just off Route 7 under a faded red sign with one of the letters half burned out. Inside, the coffee smelled strong, the vinyl booths leaned slightly at the seams, and there was a glass pie case by the register holding 3 cream pies and something with cherries on top. It was the kind of place where the waitresses knew who wanted decaf before they sat down. The owner, Martha Klein, interviewed me in a corner booth by the window while a server refilled sugar jars 2 tables away. I liked her immediately. She did not waste time on fake warmth, but she was fair. She asked direct questions, listened to the answers, and did not seem impressed by charm. She seemed impressed by reliability, which mattered more to me anyway. When I told her I could work mornings, weekends, holidays, whatever she needed, she nodded and said, "That matters in this business." For one dangerous moment, I let myself believe I might actually hear the words, "When can you start?" Instead, Martha folded her hands on the table and looked at me in a way that made my stomach drop. "Can I ask you something plain?" she said. I nodded. "Sure. Did you ever have trouble involving money?" My whole body went still. "No." She held my gaze. "No stealing, no fraud, no problems like that?" "No," I said again, more firmly this time. "Never." Martha leaned in and lowered her voice. "Honey," somebody called. The sounds around us kept going, the clatter of dishes behind the counter, bacon hissing in the kitchen, a man near the register laughing too loud, but suddenly all of it felt far away. "What did they say?" I asked. "That you stole from an elderly woman," she said, and I could tell from her face that she hated repeating it. "Said I ought to be careful, said you had a history." I gripped the edge of the table. "Did they say who they were?" She hesitated just long enough for my pulse to start pounding in my ears. "They said they were your aunt." My aunt. That was the moment it stopped feeling random. Whoever was doing this knew where I was applying, knew how to change the story just enough to make it sound believable, and knew exactly how to wrap the lie in something that sounded trustworthy. I thanked Martha somehow, though I barely remember standing up, and walked out into the parking lot with my hands numb and my throat tight. I do remember dinner that night, or rather, I remember not tasting a bite of it. My mother talked about a church bake sale. My father complained about the news. I answered when spoken to and kept my eyes on my plate. Inside, something had gone cold and sharp. I waited until the house settled. My mother always spent an hour in her sewing room after dinner. My father always dozed off in his recliner before dragging himself up to lock the doors and check the thermostat. I listened for all of it from my bedroom. The low television, the hallway floorboard, the bathroom faucet, his bedroom door closing. Only when the silence felt complete did I step into the hall. I went into my mother's sewing room in the dark, using only the moonlight coming through the side window. For a moment I just stood there, looking at the drawers, knowing that whatever I found would change something I could not undo. Then I opened the top drawer. Under folded fabric and a tin of buttons sat a red notebook. I knew what it was before I touched it. When I opened it, the first name I saw on the page was Ray Pike. For a second, I just stood there in the dark with the notebook open in my hands, too stunned to turn the page and too terrified to close it. It was one of my mother's small red notebooks, the kind she used for grocery lists, church reminders, and measurements for sewing patterns, but in that moment it felt heavier than paper should feel. I carried it closer to the window where the moonlight fell across the sewing table in a pale strip, and that was when I saw the handwriting clearly. My mother's. Neat. Careful. Controlled. Ray Pike, Marlowe County Building Supply. Called 1014A. M. Hesitant but receptive. Follow up if interview scheduled. I stared at the words until they blurred, then forced myself to keep reading. Ridge Hollow Pharmacy. Called 97 a.m. Mentioned prior financial trouble. Ashbury Home Goods. Left voicemail call again after lunch. Linton Storage. Manager not available. Sharon to retry Thursday. It was all there, line after line, laid out with the same tidy precision she used for holiday menus and coupon envelopes. Then, underneath those entries, in darker ink and blockier letters that I recognized instantly as my father's, were 4 words that changed everything. No job equals no escape. I read that sentence twice, then a third time, and with each pass something inside me went colder and harder. Up until that moment, I had still been trying to give them some softer explanation, a misunderstanding, a coincidence, some ugly rumor moving through town faster than I realized. But this was not a rumor. This was a system. This was planning. I turned the page. More names, more businesses, some I recognized immediately. The diner off Route 7 was underlined twice, and next to it, in my mother's handwriting, were the words used Paula Angle. Paula. My aunt. So Martha had told me the truth. They had not just been calling employers and warning them away from me. They had been changing roles, testing which version of concern sounded most believable. A neighbor, a family friend, an aunt, whoever they needed to be in order to make the lie stick. I turned another page and felt my stomach drop even further. This page was not organized by business name. It was organized around me. Library Tuesdays. Check mileage before dinner. Ask about gas receipt. Watch for new shoes. Interview clothes. I sat down hard in my mother's sewing chair, the wood edge digging into the backs of my legs. Until then, part of me had believed they were somehow finding out where I applied after the fact and then interfering. That had already felt horrible enough. This was worse. This meant they were watching for signs before I ever got that far, counting miles on the car, looking at what I wore, checking receipts, tracking my movements by the smallest details, the way someone tracks an animal path through snow. A sound cracked in the hallway and my whole body seized. I snapped the notebook shut and held my breath, staring at the door. For 1 second, I thought my father was standing on the other side of it. Then the pipes knocked once in the wall and I realized it was only the house settling, the same sound I had heard my whole life and never noticed until fear gave it a shape. I let out a shaky breath and looked back down at the notebook in my lap. I could have put it back then. I could have slid it under the folded fabric and the tin of buttons, gone to bed, and pretended I had never seen any of it. That would have been the safer choice. That would also have been the old choice, the one they had trained me to make every time reality became too painful to look at directly. Don't ask, don't push, don't make trouble. But once you see the truth in your mother's handwriting and your father's ink pressed into the same page, there is no going back to innocence. So I opened it again and kept reading. The earliest entry I found was dated 3 days after my 26th birthday. 3 days. They had started almost immediately, not after a screaming match, not after some dramatic threat to leave, not after anything they could later point to as justification. They had started because I made one private email address and one quiet move toward a life they could not control. That was all it took. I do not know how long I sat there in that patch of moonlight with the notebook open in my hands, long enough for my fingers to cramp, long enough for the last soft part of me to stop searching for a kinder explanation. By the time I stood up, I knew there was no putting that notebook back and pretending I had not seen it. I carried it into the kitchen and set it in the center of the table, right beside the coffee maker, where my mother would see it the second she walked in. Then I went back to my room and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and listening to every small sound in the house with a new understanding. The refrigerator humming, the pipes shifting, my father coughing once down the hall, my mother getting up in the night to use the bathroom. 2 people sleeping peacefully under the same roof where they had been dismantling my future line by line. By morning, I was no longer confused. I was furious. When my mother walked into the kitchen in her robe with her hair flattened from sleep, she stopped dead at the sight of the red notebook on the table. A second later, my father came in behind her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't look away. My mother walked into the kitchen in her robe with her hair flattened on one side from sleep, saw the red notebook beside the coffee maker, and stopped so suddenly it was almost like she had hit something solid. For a second, she just stared at it. Then her eyes lifted to mine. Not confusion, not even surprise, really. Recognition. She knew exactly what it was, exactly why it was there, and exactly what I had seen. A heartbeat later, my father came in behind her, already knotting the belt of his robe, and I watched his face change as soon as he followed her gaze to the table. Nobody spoke. The coffee pot clicked once as it finished heating. Outside, a truck went past on the road in front of the house, its tires hissing over damp pavement. I had been awake all night, and the exhaustion had done something strange to me. It had burned away the shakier parts. I did not feel calm, exactly, but I felt clear enough to know that if I let either of them speak first, they would drag the whole thing back into the familiar swamp of excuses, guilt, and half-truths where they had always held the advantage. So I put my hand on the notebook and said, "Explain it." My mother looked at my father before she looked back at me, and that alone told me more than any denial could have. "You went through my things?" she asked, her voice thin with outrage that arrived much too fast to be real. "Yes," I said. "Explain it." She pressed a hand to her chest like I had wounded her. "Elena, that is private. Those are my job applications." Her face changed then. The injury in it did not disappear, but something underneath it hardened. "I was trying to protect you." I let out one short, unbelieving breath through my nose. "By calling employers and telling them I stole from people?" My father pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, like this was a conversation he had expected all along and was prepared to manage. That was his style. Never rush. Never react too fast. Let the other person spend their emotion first. "Your mother was concerned," he said. And frankly, she had reason to be. I stared at him. Reason to be? You are not ready to be out on your own, he said. That isn't cruelty. That's reality. I could feel my heartbeat in my hands. So you lied. Over and over. My mother stepped toward the table. We did what we had to do. You have no idea what can happen to a young woman by herself. Men lie. Employers take advantage. People look for someone naive. You think a little office job is safety? You think a diner or a store means independence? It means exposure. I'm 26. And still vulnerable, she snapped. The speed of it startled even her. She blinked, then her expression softened again into something wet and trembling. You don't understand what the world is like, Elena. You've always been sheltered. A laugh nearly came out of me then, but it would have sounded too ugly. Sheltered by who? My father ignored that. This conversation ends now. No. My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I did not pull it back. No, it doesn't. You wrote this. I flipped the notebook open and jabbed my finger at the page. No job equals no escape. That's your handwriting. His eyes dropped to the notebook for less than a second. You're reading that dramatically. I felt something inside me turn clean and hot. Dramatically? You tracked my mileage. You checked receipts. You watched what I wore. Mom wrote down every place I applied. You pretended to be Aunt Paula. You told people I was a thief. My mother's mouth tightened. Paula would have agreed with us if she'd bothered to stay in this family. There it was. That ugly little flash of truth that slips out when people are too angry to keep decorating themselves. I saw it, and so did she, because the second it landed, she started crying. Real tears this time, or close enough that it didn't matter. After everything we've done for you, she said, this is what you think of us. I looked at her and felt almost nothing. Not because I was cold, because I was too tired to keep reacting to the same performance. I think you made sure I couldn't leave. You would have failed, my father said flatly. The room went still. He had not raised his voice. He never needed to. But there it was at last, the belief underneath all the concern and careful wording. Not fear for me, contempt for me. You would have failed, he repeated. And then what? You come crawling back after making a mess of your life, after humiliating this family all over town? We prevented that. My throat tightened so hard it hurt. By destroying my chances before I had any. By keeping you from making a fool of yourself. I looked from him to my mother, waiting for her to flinch, to deny it, to show some sign that she heard how monstrous that sounded. She didn't. She stood there with tears on her face and the sleeve of her robe twisted in one fist, looking at me as if I were the one being cruel. That was the moment something final happened in me. Not the discovery, not the anger, the end of bargaining. I closed the notebook and said, very quietly, if you do this again, I'm leaving. My mother froze. My father leaned back in his chair, not startled, not worried, just assessing. With what money? He asked. The question hung in the room like a blade. And in that instant, before I even checked the balance, before I asked for my papers, before I packed a single thing, I knew he had already thought 3 moves ahead. With what money? The question stayed in the kitchen after my father said it, cold and sharp as glass. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. That was what made it worse. He said it like a man pointing out the weather, like we were discussing something obvious and practical, instead of the fact that he had just reminded me how little of my life I actually controlled. My mother stood near the counter with tears still on her face, twisting the sleeve of her robe as if she were the one being hurt here. My father sat at the table, waiting. He already knew what I was going to do next. He knew I would go upstairs, open my banking app, and finally see how completely they had boxed me in. I checked before breakfast dishes were even cleared. I went to my room, shut the door, and opened the app with hands that would not stop shaking. For one stupid second, while the screen lagged, I let myself believe maybe he had only been bluffing. Then the balance loaded. I stared at the number until it stopped looking real. That account held every small piece of independence I had ever managed to save. Money from high school shifts, church nursery work, birthday cards from relatives, cash I tucked away in the only place I had ever been told was safe. My mother had been on the account since I was a teenager. I had never questioned it because in our house, questioning anything was treated like betrayal. Now I was looking at the proof of what obedience had bought me. I went back downstairs with my phone still in my hand. You emptied my account. My mother flinched, but my father answered first. It was being held for the family. It was my money. You live here, he said. You eat here. You use this house, this water, this electricity, this car. Don't stand there and act like you built some separate life under my roof. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I want my birth certificate and my social security card. My father looked at me for a long moment, then said, No. The word was so flat it barely sounded human. They're my documents. They're in this house, he said. That's where they stay. My mother stepped in then, voice softer now, trying to drape concern over the damage like a blanket over broken glass. Elena, please, just stay home for a while. Let this pass. You're upset. We can still fix this if you stop pushing. Fix it. As if they had not spent weeks making sure there was nothing left for me to stand on. I looked at her and realized something ugly and clarifying all at once. She was afraid. I could see that. But she was not afraid for me. She was afraid of what would happen if I stopped cooperating. I'm leaving, I said. That changed the room. Not loudly. My father did not slam his hand on the table. My mother did not gasp, but both of them sharpened at once, like a wire pulled tight. My mother set her coffee cup down too hard. If you walk out of this house, she said, don't expect to walk back in whenever you want. My father stood then. You can take clothes and your personal things, he said. Nothing that matters, nothing from this house that you think gives you leverage. That made more sense of him. He did not care about a backpack or a toothbrush. He cared about money, documents, anything that might let me survive without coming back. I went upstairs and packed. There was no grand decision in it by then. Just movement. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, underwear, toothbrush, phone charger, the framed photo of my grandmother Evelyn from my nightstand, the one where she stood in front of her garden in work boots with one hand on her hip, squinting into the sun like she did not fully trust cameras or most people. I slid it carefully between my clothes inside an old blue backpack and zipped it shut. Neither of them followed me upstairs. That scared me more than if they had. When I came back down, they were waiting in the hallway. That is the image that never really left me. The narrow hall, the weak yellow ceiling light, my mother in her robe with her arms folded tight across her chest, my father behind her like a wall, no shouting, no thrown objects, no dramatic scene anyone could point to later as proof they had lost control. Just a quiet blockade built out of authority and certainty and years of training me to stop when they said stop. My mother spoke first. If you leave now, she said, don't call me Mom again. I tightened my grip on the backpack strap. My father opened the front door, stepped aside and said, then go. So I did. I stepped out onto the porch with my backpack over one shoulder and my phone in my hand. The October air bit at the inside of my nose. Behind me, the screen door creaked and then slammed shut. I stood there for 1 second, looking at the same cracked driveway, the same maple tree dropping leaves into the yard, the same street I had known my whole life. Everything outside looked exactly the same, but inside that house, whatever I had once believed about family had broken for good. I walked down the driveway without turning around. At the end of the block, under a streetlight, I checked my phone battery. 14%. I checked my account again. Still $11.63. No car, no ID, no plan. Just cold air, a backpack, and the kind of silence that starts pressing on your chest when you realize there is nowhere obvious to go. Then my phone buzzed. A text from my father. Come home. Apologize. Maybe I'll discuss it. I stared at the message under that streetlight while the cold kept sinking through my coat. A dog barked somewhere down the block. A porch light flicked on across the street. My thumb hovered over the screen for a second. Then I turned the phone off and kept walking. I made it about 3 blocks before the cold started getting inside my coat for real. October in Ohio has a way of sneaking up on you after dark. It doesn't always hit like a storm. Sometimes it just keeps slipping through seams and sleeves until you realize your hands are stiff and your ears are burning and you've been clenching your jaw for half an hour. I walked with my backpack digging into one shoulder, trying not to look like someone with nowhere to go, even though that was exactly what I was. There was a gas station on the edge of town off County Road 18, the kind with 2 pumps out front, a rack of windshield fluid by the ice machine, and fluorescent lights so harsh they made everything look tired. I went there because it was the only place still open that I could reach on foot, and because bright lights felt safer than dark sidewalks. Inside, the cashier was a woman about my mother's age, with tired eyes and a red vest under her jacket. She glanced at me when I came in, took in the backpack, the face, the hour, and then looked back down at the lottery slips in front of her. I was grateful for that. Pity would have broken something in me right then. I bought the cheapest thing I could think of, a small coffee I didn't even want, just so I had a reason to stand there for a minute. The cup warmed my hands, but not by much. My phone stayed off in my pocket. I didn't want to see another message from my father. I didn't want to watch the battery die while he kept trying to pull me back by the throat. After a while, I took the coffee into the bathroom, locked myself into the last stall, and sat on the closed toilet lid with my backpack in my lap and my knees pulled together against the cold. That was where I spent most of the night. I wish I could tell you I had some plan, some moment of fierce courage where I decided exactly what came next. I didn't. I spent that night doing the kind of thinking people do when they are trying not to panic. How long until morning? How much battery if I turned the phone on for 1 minute? Whether the library opened at 9 or 10, whether Aunt Paula would answer if I called, and whether calling her would just drag her into something uglier. Whether my parents were sleeping soundly in their bed while I sat in a gas station bathroom with $11.63 and no documents. Around 4 in the morning, I must have drifted off for a few minutes, because the next thing I remember is somebody knocking lightly on the stall door. "Ma'am?" a voice said. "You okay in there?" I opened the door to find the cashier standing a few feet back, giving me enough space to keep my dignity if I wanted it. Up close, she looked older than I first thought, maybe early 60s, with deep lines around her mouth and the kind of expression that told me she had seen more than she ever said out loud. "I'm fine," I lied. She looked at the backpack, then at my face. "No, you're not." There was no sharpness in it, just fact. I don't know why that was what broke me. Maybe because it was the first honest sentence anyone had said to me in weeks. I didn't cry, not exactly, but my throat locked up and I had to look away. She didn't press. She reached into the pocket of her vest, pulled out a receipt, flipped it over, and wrote something on the back. "There's a women's shelter on Mill Street in Toledo," she said. "Riverside. You can get there by bus in the morning if you make it to the depot by 7:30. She held out the receipt. "Ask for Monica Hale." I took it with both hands like it was fragile. "Why are you helping me?" I asked before I could stop myself. She gave me a tired half-smile. "Because you came in here looking like somebody who'd been told she had nowhere left to go." Then she glanced toward the door. "And because I had a daughter once who stayed too long in places that were bad for her." That was all she said. She went back out to the register and left me standing there with the receipt in my hand and a feeling I had almost forgotten how to recognize. Not safety. Not yet. But direction. When the sky finally started lightening at the edges, I turned my phone on just long enough to check the time and map the bus depot. 3 new texts came through at once. From Dad, "Doors still open. For now." From Mom, "Please don't do this to us." From Dad again, "Come home before people start talking." I stared at that last one for a long moment. Not, "Are you safe?" Not, "Where are you?" Not, "Do you need anything?" Come home before people start talking. Even then, half frozen and bone-tired and still trying to process what my life had become in less than 12 hours, I understood exactly what mattered to him most. I turned the phone off again, tucked the receipt into my pocket, and left the gas station just after sunrise. The air was colder than it had been in the middle of the night. My backpack felt heavier. Every step hurt. But for the first time since I walked out of that house, I wasn't moving in circles. I was headed toward the bus depot, toward Riverside, toward a place I had never seen and never imagined I would need. And I had no idea then that months later, that same shelter would become the place where Diane Kessler finally found me. By then, Riverside was no longer just the place where I slept. It had become the place where I learned how hard survival could feel when you had been raised to believe you could never manage it alone. I had been there for 7 months. 7 months of filling out forms, replacing documents, riding buses across counties for interviews that dissolved the moment someone called ahead of me. 7 months of learning which shelves in the pantry emptied fastest, which women wanted silence in the mornings, which socks would survive the shelter laundry, and how to carry shame and exhaustion without letting either one split me open in public. I had my temporary ID by then, finally. I had a folder under my bed with copies of every rejection email I could still access, a notebook full of dates, names, and canceled interviews, and a phone full of screenshots from my father's messages. I did not have a plan yet, but I had started building a record. Somewhere inside me, instinct had turned into evidence. That morning was gray and wet, the kind of Ohio morning that makes the whole world look like it has been washed in dishwater. Monica called me into her office just after breakfast. She was sitting behind her desk with her glasses low on her nose, and there was someone in the chair beside the wall. The moment I saw the old brown leather briefcase resting upright against the woman's leg, something in my chest tightened. She stood when I walked in. Diane Kessler looked exactly the way I remembered from the shelter lobby months later in the frame of my story. Calm, self-contained, silver blonde hair pinned neatly back, a cream-colored coat buttoned to the throat. She did not move toward me too fast. She did not smile too broadly. She simply waited until Monica closed the office door and said, "Elena Mercer?" My mouth had gone dry. "Yes, my name is Diane Kessler. I'm a licensed private investigator." She reached into her coat pocket and handed me a business card and her ID. "Your grandmother, Evelyn Mercer, hired me 9 years ago." I stared at her. Monica said nothing. She just looked at me once, saw that I was staying, and sat back. 9 years ago? I repeated. Why? Diane's expression shifted very slightly, not pity exactly, but something close to it. Because she believed that one day you might need help escaping your parents. And because she believed that if that day came, you would need proof. The room went quiet in a way that made every small sound feel louder. The heater clicked in the corner. Rain tapped lightly against the narrow office window. My grandmother had been gone for years. I could still picture her in work boots, with dirt under her nails and a voice roughened by age and weather. She had been the only person in our family who ever looked at my father without flinching or flattering him. When he spoke, she listened with a face so still it had always unsettled me as a child. Back then, I thought it was stubbornness. Sitting in Monica's office, I understood it had been recognition. Diane rested one hand on the briefcase. "She left instructions," she said, "and she left this for you." When she opened it, the first thing I saw was an envelope with my name written across the front in my grandmother's hand. Not typed, not printed, her hand. My knees nearly gave out, and I had to sit down without meaning to. Diane laid the envelope carefully on the desk in front of me. For a second, I only stared at it, because once I opened it, whatever came next would become real in a new way. Then I slid my finger beneath the flap and unfolded the letter inside. "Elena, if you are reading this, then things have gotten worse than I prayed they would." That first line was enough to blur the page. I blinked hard and kept reading. "Your father learned control from his father, and your mother learned to survive by calling cruelty concern. I could not save myself when I was young, and I could not change my son into a different man. But I could do one thing. I could make sure that if you ever had to leave, you would not leave empty-handed." My hands started shaking. Diane waited in silence while I read the rest. "Your parents will make you doubt your memory, your worth, and your judgment. Do not doubt this. Wanting your own life is not betrayal. Inside this case is proof of what they have done and the means to stop them. Use it to get free. Not to go back, not to beg, to get free." I pressed my lips together so hard they hurt. When I looked up, Diane had already opened a file inside the briefcase. The folder was thick, tabbed, and organized by date. "Your grandmother retained me to monitor certain patterns of behavior," she said. "Over the last several years, that monitoring became more active." She turned the folder toward me. Phone logs, dates, employer names, notes, screenshots of anonymous emails, transcripts of recorded calls. There were copies of messages sent from accounts linked back to my parents' home internet. There were still photographs of my mother's red notebook taken through the kitchen window during surveillance visits. There were summaries of conversations where my mother identified herself by different names and warned employers that I had a record for theft or fraud. There were entries matching my canceled interviews so exactly that my stomach turned. "I have 29 documented employer contacts," Diane said quietly. 6 falsified email reports. Repeated evidence of coordinated interference. I could barely get the words out. My grandmother knew this would happen? "She believed it could," Diane said. "And she wanted you protected if she was right." Then she reached into the bottom compartment of the briefcase and took out a second envelope, thicker this time, sealed with the name of a law office in Toledo. "There's more," she said. "Your grandmother also established a trust." I looked at her, not understanding. "She sold the farm before she died," Diane said. "The proceeds were placed into a protected trust, managed conservatively. It is now worth $287,000. She slid the papers toward me. "You are the sole beneficiary." For a second, the room seemed to drop away beneath me. Not because of the money, not at first, but because for the first time in my life, someone in my family had not just seen what was happening to me. She had believed me before I even knew I would need to be believed. She had planned for my freedom before I understood I would have to fight for it. I looked down at the letter again, then at the evidence file, then at the trust papers waiting beneath Diane's hand. And for the first time since I had walked out of my parents' house with $11.63 in my account, I understood something that felt almost as frightening as fear. I had a way forward. For a few seconds, I could not speak. I sat there in Monica's office with my grandmother's letter in one hand and the trust papers lying open in front of me, feeling as if the floor of my life had shifted in a way I did not yet know how to survive. Diane did not rush me. Monica did not interrupt. Outside the office, I could hear the shelter moving through its ordinary morning sounds, someone laughing too loudly in the hallway, the scrape of a chair, a microwave door slamming shut, but inside that room, everything had narrowed to paper, proof, and possibility. The first practical thing I said was, "What do I do now?" Diane looked almost relieved to hear it. "First, you meet with the attorney your grandmother arranged," she said. "Then you access the trust, in that order." That turned out to matter. My grandmother had understood something I was only beginning to learn. Money can help you survive, but strategy is what keeps the people who hurt you from rewriting the story again. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting in a law office in downtown Toledo across from Naomi Pierce, a civil litigator with a dark green blazer, a legal pad full of color-coded notes, and the kind of face that seemed permanently unimpressed by lies. Diane had already sent the evidence file ahead. Naomi had read enough of it by the time I arrived to skip sympathy and go straight to clarity. "This is actionable," she said, turning one page after another. "Defamation, tortious interference with prospective employment, patterned harassment, possibly more, depending on what discovery gives us." I had never heard anyone talk about my parents in that language before. Not difficult, not controlling, not overprotective, actionable. It felt like watching someone translate a private nightmare into a public fact. Naomi moved quickly. With Diane's documentation, my screenshots of my father's texts, my mother's notebook, and a growing list of employers who could verify the calls, the case did not have to lean on my word alone. That was the miracle of it. My parents had spent my whole life making sure that if I ever accused them of anything, I would sound emotional and they would sound reasonable. But reasonable people do not create fake allegations of theft to keep their daughter unemployable. Reasonable people do not track mileage, monitor gas receipts, and lie to businesses under borrowed names. On paper, stripped of tone and tears and family history, what they had done looked exactly as ugly as it was. My parents were served 3 days later. My father was handed the complaint outside the mailbox at the house on Willow Lane. My mother was served in the parking lot of Benton Falls Fresh Market, with 2 women from church standing less than 20 feet away beside a cart return. I didn't witness either scene myself, but I heard enough afterward. In a town that size, legal papers travel faster than gossip, mostly because they become gossip almost immediately. By dinner, people were talking. By the next morning, they were looking up the case number online. My father called me 11 times in one afternoon. I did not answer once. He texted after that, "You are humiliating this family. You've been manipulated. Come home before this gets worse." Naomi printed every message and added them to the file. Then my mother began the softer campaign, through neighbors, through churchwomen, through people who liked casseroles, prayer chains, and stories where mothers are always trying their best. She cried in public. She told people I had become unstable. She said outside influences had poisoned me against my family. For about a week, it worked on some of them. Then the court filings started spreading. That was the part my father had not planned for. In Benton Falls, plenty of people were small-minded, but very few were illiterate. Once the complaint was public, once people could read about the employer calls, the false theft claims, the fake reports, the shelter harassment, the pattern became impossible to dress up as concern. Ray Pike agreed to give a statement. Martha Klein did too. A warehouse manager Naomi tracked down still had a voicemail record attached to my application file. Monica documented the call from the woman pretending to be a social worker and turned it over. Piece by piece, the version of my parents that the town had always preferred began to split open. The court granted a temporary protection order first. No contact, no third-party messages, no calls, no texts, no showing up where I lived or worked. My father violated it within 6 days by borrowing someone else's phone to send me one line. "You think paper can make you equal to me?" Naomi smiled when she read that one, not because it was funny, but because it was useful. Contempt warnings followed. The judge was not sentimental about family matters dressed up as terror. And then, the social tide shifted. My mother's church friends stopped calling as often. My father's usual table at the coffee shop went empty around him. People who had once praised my parents for keeping such a close family started lowering their voices when their names came up. Nobody in Benton Falls suddenly became brave or noble. That is not how places like that change. They changed because the math stopped working. My parents' story required me to be unstable, ungrateful, and dishonest. The documents required them to be deliberate. For the first time in my life, the truth did not need me to defend it with tears. It could stand on its own. And once it did, my parents began to fall. And once they did not fall all at once. That would have been cleaner, easier to narrate, easier to survive. Real life is meaner than that. People who build their identities around power do not collapse with dignity. They claw, they deny, they revise, and when the walls finally start closing in, they look for one last way to make their shame somebody else's burden. The civil case moved faster after the protection order. My father refused to settle. Naomi told me that was not unusual for men like him. He did not object because he thought he would win. He objected because settling would require admitting that what he had done counted. So he delayed, blustered, missed deadlines, and finally tried representing himself for exactly long enough to humiliate the version of authority he had spent a lifetime polishing. My mother hid behind tears and church language for as long as she could, but tears do not erase phone logs, and casseroles do not cancel metadata. By the time the judge entered the default judgment, the number itself almost did not matter to me anymore. Damages, fees, restrictions, a lien against the house if payment did not come. The law had finally named what they had done, and for the first time since I was a child, their version of reality was not the only one in the room. Naomi helped me access the trust the same week. I remember sitting in a quieter office than hers, signing papers with a pen that felt too heavy in my hand, still half afraid that someone would stop the process and say there had been a mistake. No one did. My grandmother had planned too carefully for that. The money became real in stages, which suited me. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment in Perrysburg with a narrow galley kitchen, beige carpet, and a front door that locked with a key that belonged only to me. I bought a used Toyota Corolla that rattled at red lights and smelled faintly like old fries in the upholstery. I opened a bank account with my name on it and no one else's. I bought groceries without asking permission. The first time I stood in my own kitchen and made pasta at 9:30 at night just because I wanted to, I had to sit down afterward because the quiet felt so enormous. Naomi offered me part-time administrative work while the case was still winding through its final motions. At first it was simple things, filing, scheduling, scanning exhibits, organizing correspondence, but even that felt like a kind of restoration. Not charity. Work. Paid work. Useful work. The kind no one could intercept with a phone call. Monica cried when I told her I was moving out of Riverside, though she disguised it by pretending she had something in her eye. Diane hugged me once, briefly, like a woman who did not waste gestures. Then she handed me my grandmother's letter in a protective sleeve and told me to keep it somewhere dry and safe. I still have it. You would think this is where the story softens. In some ways it does. I slept through the night more often. I stopped checking every unknown number with a surge of dread. I learned which cupboard held the coffee and which one held the plates, and little by little, ordinary life stopped feeling like a privilege I had stolen. But endings are rarely kind enough to stay contained inside a courtroom. 3 months after the judgment, a forwarded envelope arrived from Riverside. My parents did not have my new address, and the protection order barred direct contact, so my mother had sent it to the shelter hoping it would find me anyway. Monica called first and asked if I wanted her to open it. I said no. I drove over after work and sat in the parking lot with the envelope on my lap before finally tearing it open. Inside was a photocopied ultrasound image, 12 weeks. No letterhead from a doctor, no card, no apology, just the image and a note in my mother's handwriting on yellow-lined paper. Your cousin Megan is having a baby. Your father says if you drop the lien, maybe there's still a way for you to be part of this child's life. I read it once, then again, because my mind refused to accept how nakedly vicious it was. Not we were wrong, not we are sorry, not I should never have helped destroy your life. They had taken a child not yet born, a baby who had done nothing except exist, and turned that life into leverage, a bargaining chip, a family coupon. Drop the lien, surrender the consequence, and maybe they would allow me proximity to innocence. I sat there in my car with the ultrasound trembling in my hand and felt a kind of anger so pure it almost cleared me out from the inside. That was the last thing my mother ever sent me. Naomi added the note to the file, documented the contact, and sent the warning through the proper channels. I kept the ultrasound, though, not for them, for me, as proof that I had not imagined the moral shape of what they were. Some people hurt you because they are broken. Others hurt you because control has become more important to them than love. My parents chose the second kind, again and again, even after the law, the town, and the truth had all caught up with them. I never went back. That does not mean I never grieved. I did. I grieved the parents I should have had, the years they took, the version of myself that used to think endurance was the same thing as loyalty. But grief is not the same as regret, and healing is not the same as reunion. I learned that slowly, in my little apartment, with my used car, my files at Naomi's office, and a life built out of things nobody could confiscate anymore. I'm 29 now. I work, I sleep, I pay my own bills, and I keep my grandmother's letter in the top drawer of my dresser beside my passport and my own house key. My parents are still alive somewhere in Ohio. Maybe they still tell people I was manipulated. Maybe they still say I turned cruel. Maybe my father still believes paper should never have been allowed to make me his equal. He was wrong about that, like he was wrong about almost everything that mattered. What my grandmother understood, long before I did, was this. Love does not tighten the leash when you reach for a life of your own. Love does not empty your bank account, steal your documents, poison your future, or trade a baby's ultrasound for silence. Love makes room for your freedom, even when it cannot stand beside you in it. That is what she gave me. Not just money. Not just proof. Permission to leave without apologizing for surviving. And once I understood that, the rest of my life could finally begin. Here are the practical lessons viewers can take from this story. This story shows that control is not the same as love. Some people will call it protection, concern, sacrifice, or family duty. But if someone is destroying your ability to work, make choices, support yourself, or build a future, that is not love. It is control. Another lesson is that abuse does not always look violent from the outside. Sometimes it looks polite. Sometimes it sounds calm. Sometimes it hides behind phrases like, "I'm only trying to help you," or "You're not ready yet." A person can hurt you deeply without ever raising their voice. That is why it is so important to judge behavior by outcomes, not by the image someone presents. The story also teaches that financial control is one of the most dangerous forms of power. When someone has access to your money, your documents, your job opportunities, and your reputation, they can trap you without ever locking a door. Real independence means protecting your own bank account, your own identification, and your own path to work. A very important lesson is to trust patterns, not excuses. One bad event can be an accident. Two might still be bad luck. But when the same kind of harm keeps happening again and again, pay attention. Patterns reveal intention. Elena survived because she stopped explaining everything away and finally accepted what the pattern meant. Documentation matters. Saving texts, writing down dates, keeping records, and holding on to evidence can change everything. Memory can be attacked. Feelings can be dismissed. But evidence speaks clearly. In real life, if someone is sabotaging you, keeping records may become the thing that protects your future. The story also reminds viewers that leaving is not betrayal. Wanting to work, to live on your own, to make decisions for yourself, or to protect your peace does not make you ungrateful. Sometimes the most necessary choice is walking away from people who share your blood but keep breaking your life. Another lesson is that healing does not always require reconciliation. Many people believe a story is only complete if the victim forgives and returns, but real healing can mean distance. It can mean boundaries. It can mean building a peaceful life without reopening the same door that nearly destroyed you. Finally, the deepest lesson is this: real love helps you become free. It does not shrink you. It does not sabotage you. It does not force you to beg for the right to exist. Real love may not always be loud, but it will never punish you for trying to stand on your own. A strong closing takeaway for the audience could be: if someone must destroy your future to keep you close, they do not love you, they fear losing control. And choosing your freedom is not cruelty, it is survival.